The Porsche 911, one of the greatest sports car icons of all time, is all new for 2020, but you may not be able to tell from the outside. At least not at first glance, and probably not from 40 feet away. You'd have to notice the more rounded tail end, the raised 3D Porsche script across the car's keister, and, if you have laser cat-like vision, the 1.8-inch wider track in front. But it is all new. It has a prodigious amount of aluminum, for instance, making up over 60% of the sheet metal, whereas the old one was made up of around 30%. It has a new 8-speed dual-clutch transmission that guarantees you'll be in the right spot of the power band right when you need it most. And while the displacement of the flat 6 remains at 2,981 ccs, almost everything else about the engine is new, including a new, higher peak power output of 443 HP. But it sure looks like previous Porsches. That's not necessarily a bad thing, since the car it is replacing was also one of the best in the world, and this one is simply better, if a bit too familiar. That may calm the fears of the faithful who fret that with every new model 911 that comes along, this is the 8th, Porsche will somehow have messed up their dream car. Worry not, Porsche files, your dream car is still dreamy, and now even faster. I know it's faster because I just spent a day hammering on it over the roads and passes of eastern Spain, and during several laps of the tasty 14-turn Circuit de la Comunitat Valencia Ricardo Tormo, and all I can say after that is, ay chihuahua, even though that's New World Spanish, not old. Your beloved 911 is still great and is, in fact, better in almost every way you could measure it. Let's start from the inside and work our way out. Yes, the displacement of the engine, the bore and stroke, is same, but the new engine has new pistons, higher 10.2:1 compression ratio, more efficient viezo injectors that cram fuel into the combustion chamber at 2,900 psi, and there is now variable valve lift technology on the intake cams to accommodate high and low loads. In fact, one intake valve can open further than the other to create tumble in the chamber for better burn and a bigger bang. So the mixture is much better and more homogeneous, said Matthias Hofstetter, director of powertrain on the 911 and 718. The exhaust manifold goes from sheet metal to cast steel in the new engine. This means you have much better behavior concerning pressure drop and pulse in front of the turbine, said Hofstetter. When you have a higher pulse on the turbine wheel, a higher speed from the turbocharger wheel, you have much better response. The turbo wastegate is now operated electrically instead of by vacuum, another factor resulting in increased precision and control. The result is 443 HP at 6,500 RPM and 390 lb-ft from 2,300 to 5,000 revs. That's 148 HP per liter for those keeping score at home. That power and torque go through a new 8-speed dual-clutch PDK transmission. A 7-speed manual is coming and will be available when the car launches in late summer. A hybrid 911 is also coming, though not at launch. There is space now inside the new PDK transmission to accommodate an electric motor. The decision hasn't been made yet as to whether it will be a plug-in hybrid or just a hybrid. So hybrid production is far from imminent. Cabriolet production will come before hybrids, but just after the coupes, late summer as near as I can tell. On the Audi Carrera 4s there is a new front drive shaft with liquid-cooled differential that can handle up to 500 Nm, or 369 lb-ft of torque, which is almost 95% of the total torque output. You can provide more torque for longer before it overheats, said Hofstetter. You could take the car for a spin on an ice lake and keep drifting. We did that in winter testing and in sport driver tests and training. So in the 4s you will have no excuses for not exiting corners quickly. Under normal driving conditions the front axle gets 30% of torque. For the suspension, let's start on the outside and work in. The front gets 20-inch wheels and the rear gets 21s. The rear Pirelli P0s are significantly wider, according to Porsche. This results in a track that is 1.8 inches wider at the front of both models, as well as a 1.5 inches wider track width at the rear, Porsche said. With wider tracks front and rear, Porsche felt confident in making the steering more direct. Thus, steering ratio is 14.1:1 with the optional rear wheel steering and 15.0:1 without it. The electric rear steering cants the rear wheels up to 2 degrees with the fronts at high speeds and 2 degrees opposite the fronts at slow speeds. Up to this generation of 911 we didn't want to make the steering any more aggressive than it was, said Ulrich Morbitzer, head of chassis development for the 911 and 718. But now that we have the bigger wheels we got more stability in the rear, and now with the extra traction and lateral grip added at the contact patch it allowed us to sharpen the steering ratio even more. Suspension is McPherson strut front and aluminum multi-link rear. The dampers are all new inside, controlled by software that Porsche wrote in-house. We have a 4D chassis controller which connects all the major chassis systems in real time, said Morbitzer. All of those individual systems are routed and connected to a driving dynamics controller, a special ECU just for that, and because it's coordinating all those inputs, it can react faster. All that sits in a chassis that was 63% steel in the previous 911 and is now only about 30%, with the rest being aluminum. And while curb weight has risen about 121 pounds in the new car, the weight-to-power ratio is actually better, 7.7 lb/HP on the Carrera S and 7.9 on the Carrera Force. Life is full of trade-offs, but this is a good one. Can you feel all that from behind the wheel? I set out in a rear-drive Carrera S to find out. First thing you'll notice is the new seats. They grip well without suffocating you. There is lateral grip, as you'll find out almost immediately, but you'll find there is still plenty of comfort for a day-long drive. The dash is nicely laid out in what Porsche calls a more horizontal alignment. There is a row of 5 old-school toggle switches, one for traction control, one for PASM and 3 that you can program yourself. The gear shift looks like, I am not making this up, an electric shaver. Wouldn't it be cool if you could pop it off, shave your smirking mug, and pop it back on? Porsche? Norelco? Anybody? The shifter/shaver toggles down for drive and up for reverse. Park is a push button. Paddle shifts perch on the wheel. To start the car you twist a fake key on the dash left of the steering wheel, of course, and you're off. My first experience was from the passenger seat while my CO Piloto drove, and I can tell you that it is a much quieter car, as Porsche has engineered it to be. In addition to both active and passive engine and transmission mounts, the rear engine mounts were moved about 9 inches forward. The result is less acoustic intrusion into the cab. Likewise, the newly tuned suspension in normal mode was as comfy as a GT in this icon of a sports car. My turn to drive came way up in the hills between 2 mountainous national parks, the Parc Natural de Cerezot de Chera and the Parc Natural del Turia. Both Spain and Portugal have a tradition of building mountain roads that are way more narrow than what we in the States would call 2 lanes. These were mostly 1 lane, sometimes as much as 1.5 lanes wide, but they were open to traffic in both directions. The outside temp gauge was reading just above freezing, too, and sported an artsy snowflake to remind us that in addition to head-on collisions, we would also be skating off the cliff to our doom. That was helpful. So in these conditions, my CO Piloto was amused at my near-continuous use of the words at number $% and plus $number at %. As we rounded each blind curve, our lives hanging in equal balance with the truck driver I knew was barreling around in the opposite direction. So I slowed to a crawl as I approached each death turn, ready to slam on the mighty and optional Porsche ceramic composite brakes and save us all. But soon enough the road got a little less dangerous, and on the parts where I could see far enough ahead, I opened it up. Ah yes, this is why everyone loves Porsches. I had already wound the little round knob on the steering wheel from normal mode to Sport Plus, and I must say the performance jumped accordingly. While I could still feel some jounce in the front end, the car remained remarkably stable. The pavement was smooth and new, with only a few undulations here and there, and the Carrera S took them all in stride, all 4 P0s feeling equally grippy. I kept waiting to feel some hint of understeer. In previous 911s I'm sure that, as hard as I was pushing this car, understeer would have crept into the front end. But it never did. Likewise, the slight bobbing of the front end that comes from hanging the big heavy engine out aft of the rear axle, never really appeared, at least not to the extent that it did in the 991.2, the previous Porsche. The power from the flat 6 was never lacking. While I'm sure that there will be far more powerful Porsches coming in this new configuration of 911, I never once felt that I wanted more for the aggressive canyon carving kamikaze cruise that I was on. Likewise, I never felt like I was waiting for the turbos to spool up. The power curve felt like a regal procession up the graph. Indeed, a subsequent look at a power and torque graph confirmed what I had felt on the road, a nice, diagonal line from 1,500 rpm to 6,500 rpm, whereupon it barely fell off as it hit the 7,500 rpm red line. This is a thoroughly enjoyable car to spend not just a day in, but an entire 3-year lease, or even a lifetime of ownership. If you've been waiting for the right time to bite the bullet and buy, this 911 could be it. 5 laps around the circuit Ricardo Tormo did not change my mind on that assessment at all. It only increased my appreciation for all those German engineers working all those hours on what maybe didn't look all that new a car. But it is. On the track, again in Sport Plus, the new 911 was a blast, rocketing down the front straight and hunkering down through all 14 corners of the track. Fast, slow, it took them all and never faltered. Ideally, I would have liked more track time, but it wasn't my car and it wasn't my track. They did let us try out the 911's new wet mode on a lawn sprinkler-drenched go-kart track. Acoustic sensors in the wheel wells detect when water drops are hitting them and will tell the driver to switch on wet mode. In it, torque is reduced and channeled more to the front tires, Porsche Stability Management, PSM, and Porsche Traction Management, PTM, are dialed up and the rear wing automatically deploys full flaps. I tried negotiating the wet go-kart track with and without wet mode and indeed, it was faster with it. But it was by no means smooth. I can imagine a day when a car's ECU has way more memory storage and can program itself to drive like Derek Bell at Le Mans in the rain. As it is, wet mode somewhat clumsily saves us from ourselves when it rains. Insurance companies will like it and so, ultimately, will you. All of those drives had been in a rear-drive Carrera S. So later that day I weaseled an odd Carrera 4s out of the German fleet managers and attacked some traffic circles near the Circuito, looking for understeer, oversteer, or just better front grip. I found a little of the front grip, but I wasn't really pushing it hard enough in those conditions, empty roundabouts with curbs and guardrails everywhere, to really find the limits. That will require a nice, long-term loan of one of these. Maybe a year. Maybe 3. I'm sure my friends at Porsche will agree. So, should you turn in your current 911 and get one of these? Yes, of course you should. It's $114,550 for a Carrera S, but it's more comfortable, you can drive it every day, and you can race it on weekends. I don't see any downside to any of this. So it's agreed then, I'll see you at track day in my long-termer. Adios, amigos.